لما نستشهد من روح الجنة، لما نستشهد من روح الجنة، لا تقول علينا صغار، من هالعيشة زين أكبر، من غير فلسطين شو يعني طفولة، من غير فلسطين شو يعني.
December 29th, 2008. The Gaza war had just begun, but already, Israeli missiles were raining down on the Gaza Strip, annihilating police buildings, military bases, and anything they deemed to be a threat. It was carnage on the streets, as residents in the Strip were left helplessly waiting to see what target Israel would choose next. Though that day, when the missiles again fell from the sky, they would strike a rather strange target, a small, little-known TV station called Al-Aqsa TV, and that day, it was Israel's sole intention to end their broadcast forever. Though when the smoke cleared, the broadcast somehow remained. With content comparable to the public access channel, you might think this is an odd site to attack, especially when it's revealed that the attacks didn't even end there. In 2014, Al-Aqsa TV's headquarters would again be bombed and destroyed, as well as in 2018, and even as recently as 2021.
Oh my god, yes, I need to go down. We're going to direct the camera now towards the explosion.
Though through it all, their broadcast has stayed on the air. And you might be right, this would be a bizarre target, had Al-Aqsa TV been like any other station. In reality, the content played on their airwaves featured propaganda, the likes of which we have never really seen in the modern age. And at the heart of it all was one program that stood above the rest, as rather than focusing on the adults in the region, it was instead aimed at the youth, the future of the country, the pioneers of tomorrow, culminating into what can only be described as the darkest children's show ever created.
Tomorrow's Pioneers, a weekly children's show.
It looks like Mickey Mouse. It sounds like Mickey Mouse. But do you think Mickey Mouse would ever tell kids to fight Americans and the Jews?
Before we fall down this rabbit hole, I want to first thank today's sponsor, Babbel. Babbel is the #1 language learning site in the world, with programs designed to teach you real-life practical conversation skills in just about any language you can think of. For me, it's always been my dream to travel to Italy and visit some vineyards and eat some amazing food. But without knowing at least some of the language, I knew I would be completely lost. So lately, I've been doing Babbel's quick 10-minute Italian lessons each day, which have been perfect for my busy schedule. And these lessons are so interactive that Babbel actually uses speech recognition to help perfect my pronunciations and my accent. And of all my attempts at trying to learn new languages in my life, this has by far produced the fastest results. And because of this, I highly recommend Babbel for anyone who has big travel plans this summer, as it really is the perfect way to prepare for trips abroad. So if this sounds like something you're interested in, you can click the link in the description, where you'll receive 65% off your very own Babbel subscription to start learning a new language today. Tomorrow's Pioneers. It's a TV show that premiered in Palestine over a decade ago, that today is rarely if ever spoken of. And when it is mentioned, it's often brought up in a comedic way, as some of its scenes are so ridiculous that it can be undeniably hilarious at times, with some of its more iconic moments turning into well-known memes across the web. But we'll get more into that soon. As though it is funny at times, the truth is that its premise and the effects that it likely had on the children of the region is horrifying to say the least. The show premiered back in 2007, a year after the inception of Al-Aqsa TV, the channel it would air on, with the station itself being run by a group known as Hamas, considered here in the US and in many other countries to be a terrorist organization. Hamas are known for their unwavering desire to reclaim the land that they believe was taken from them by Israel years ago. And in an extremely oversimplified version of events, since the year 1948, Palestine has lost roughly 85% of what once was their land to the hands of Israel, causing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to become displaced, with many being forced to cram into a small area known as the Gaza Strip. Unsurprisingly, this has led to never-ending conflict between the two sides, as many Palestinians feel they had their land stolen from them, and no one believes this more strongly than Hamas. This military party has goals of reclaiming their land by using any means necessary, with their most infamous tactic being the use of suicide bombing, which they promote heavily within their group as a means of martyrdom. By 2006, the group would gain control over the Gaza Strip, immediately making them the most powerful political organization in all of Palestine. And with this came the creation of Al-Aqsa TV. Hamas wanted to assure that the rest of the country was as angry and willing to fight against Israel as they were, and so they created this network with the sole purpose of spreading hatred and promoting violence against their enemies, which included any supporters of Israel like the United States. And they were anything but subtle with how they approached this, leading to most of their programs looking something like this.
اللهم عليك باليهود ومن هاودهم والنصارى ومن ناصرهم فأحصهم عددا واقتلهم بددا ولا تغادر منهم أحدا.
But even if you believe that Hamas's anger is justified, considering what was taken from them, what they chose to do next is a lot harder to excuse, as they began gearing this same type of content towards the children of Palestine. As after all, children are the most impressionable members of our society, and if they could expose them to this type of content at a young age, they could essentially breed loyal Hamas soldiers who would share their same hatred with Israel. And thus, Tomorrow's Pioneers was born. The show began its run back in April of 2007 and would proceed from there with 4 confirmed seasons and roughly 21 well-archived episodes, with many more currently missing, as unfortunately, given how obscure the show was, most of it stands today as lost media. But thankfully, the majority of the program's most shocking moments have been archived, as well as some of the actual transcripts from other episodes, and with these, we can piece together a good chunk of what the show was, and ultimately come to a conclusion as to why exactly it was made. The episodes would feature a reoccurring host named Sarah, who at the time of the first episode's release was just 8 years old, and she would be joined by her animal co-host, the first of which being a large mouse named Farfour. And if this character looks familiar, well, it's because it's literally just a man in a cheap Mickey Mouse costume, accounting for what would by far become the show's most infamous character. Together, the pair would talk about issues happening throughout Palestine, while performing skits, singing songs, and featuring call-in sections where the young viewers could talk to the hosts in order to seek advice or guidance. And though this may seem like any other kid show at the time, where it really stands out is with its subject matter, as due to it being created directly by Hamas for propaganda purposes, they certainly didn't shy away from sharing their often extreme views throughout the show, leading to an almost inexplicably bizarre and oftentimes disturbing final product. And truthfully, finding the words to describe it all is practically impossible because it is just so insane. So today, I will simply be showing you, guiding you episode by episode into the world of Tomorrow's Pioneers, and all the moments that have since gone on to make it the most disturbing children's show ever made. And the further we fall down this rabbit hole, the darker it gets.
Farfour looks like Mickey Mouse, but this Palestinian children's character doesn't talk like Mickey or sing like any Mouseketeer.
Season 1 began on the morning of April 13th, 2007, with the inaugural episode, Farfour is Caught Speaking English. The program aired in a 60-minute Friday morning time slot that was often most popular with preschoolers and other young children, as they would be the show's targeted demographic. In the show, we are introduced to Sarah and Farfour, and much like the title would suggest, its premise centers around Farfour having been caught speaking English by his uncle Hazim, a character played by Hazim al-Sharari, the actual creator of the show, to which Farfour is chastised for, as his uncle and Sarah believe he should be speaking their native language of Arabic.
فرفور إني سمعتك تقول باللغة الإنجليزية
Hello? نعم. How are you يا سراء? I hope to be good time.
نعم.
مالك يا فرفور؟ انت ليش هيك بتحكي؟ مش احنا اتفقنا ان نحكي باللغة العربية الفصحى؟
هذه اللغة يا سراء لغة العالم المتقدم، لغة العالم اللي بيفهم اللي بيخترع، بس هيك.
لا يا فرفور، انت غلطان، عشان انت بتعرفش ان المسلمين هم اساس الحضارة.
The episode then cuts to Sarah, who explains that the show will act as a nucleus for the reunion of Palestine with the land that they once owned.
أذكركم أننا نحن العظماء انطلقنا في هذا البرنامج لنقود هذا العالم، وستكون النوى بإذن الله تعالى من هنا من فلسطين.
فلسطين يا سراء من أين بالضبط؟ من غزة؟ أم من القدس؟ أم من رام الله؟ أم من كل فلسطين؟
نعم من كل فلسطين.
Leading to a monologue from Farfour where he states,
نحن رواد الغد سنعيد لهذه الأمة مجدها وسنحرر الأقصى إن شاء الله وسنحرر العراق إن شاء الله وسنحرر بلاد المسلمين التي تجتاحها هذه الأثناء القتلة.
The episode then ends with Uncle Hazim discussing the Iraq War, which was transpiring around the time of this episode's airing, to which he says, "As you can see, they kill and slaughter the children and the women. Whoever followed the news yesterday could see the fetus and its mother. I'm sure you saw that, Sarah." To which Sarah agrees, with this line referencing a particular bout of fighting that had just happened in the days prior to the show's premiere. And though nothing too outrageous, this episode gives us a glimpse at the structure of the show, as it rarely followed a coherent storyline, and instead bounces around different political messages seemingly at random. But overall, Farfour is caught speaking English is definitely mature, and probably too much so for the 3 to 5-year-olds watching at home, as it mentions bloodshed and slaughtering children, with its political messages being extremely on the nose. But this was only the beginning, and it may very well be the show's most tame episode, as with each passing installment, things only became more and more unbelievable. Today, episode 2 of season 1 appears to be almost entirely lost, except for one brief clip that has surfaced in recent years. It's titled Farfour vs. Bush, Omert and Condoleezza, and in it, we see a child call into the show to sing the hosting duo a song, but is promptly cut short due to its lyrics.
إسراء هذه الأنشودة مش كويسة، ليش؟
ليش عليها؟
عشانها فيها استسلام.
يا إسراء احنا بدناش نستسلم وإحنا بدنا نقاوم العدو.
Angry that the child had even mentioned the word surrender, the two hosts shut down her song, leading to Farfour going on a tirade, where out of nowhere he begins calling out multiple political figures from rival nations.
إن شاء الله هذه الأرض لأطفالها ورجالها ونسائها وشيوخها سننتصر يا بوش وسننتصر يا شرمات السلامة سننتصر يا موفاز راح سننتصر يا أولمر سننتصر يا كونداليزا.
The show would then follow this up with an episode featuring one of its most iconic moments. It's titled Farfour and the AK-47 and includes 2 call-in segments. One where Farfour discusses how they will one day lead the world. As a child sings, "It is the time of death, we will fight the war." This is then followed by another caller, an 11-year-old named Harwa, who sings a song about how Israel will answer for the incident that forced their people to relocate. And according to the child singing this song, the answer to the Israeli problem is an AK-47. to which Farfour then mimics the lyrics by simulating throwing grenades and shooting one of these weapons, leading to this notorious moment that is both really funny, yet also deeply disturbing when you really think about it, as the show is very obviously implying that the only way they will get their land back and truly deal with this issue is by use of force, especially considering that just prior to this, they showcased lyrics promoting warfare and never surrendering to Israel, providing one of the show's very first allusions to violence, which will become much more common of a theme as the episodes go by. And by this point, it's pretty clear that kids probably shouldn't be exposed to this kind of content, and the world was starting to take notice.
This program, broadcast on Hamas-owned television, tells its young Arab viewers to take up arms against Americans and Israelis.
But truthfully, the controversy was just getting started, as by this point, yes, the show is definitely disturbing, especially knowing that there were kids watching, but all in all, many would argue that it's more comical than anything. And recognizing this, the showrunners seemingly grew unsatisfied with their current product. They didn't want kids just laughing along with the program. They wanted them to hate Israel, and they wanted them angry, upset, and willing to fight at a moment's notice. And so, they began doubling down on their ideology, with episode 4 taking a far more direct approach towards breeding anti-Semitism. The episode shows Farfour in a classroom taking a final exam, before he is caught using a cheat sheet by his teacher, and in response to this, the mouse gives one of the craziest excuses you will ever hear in all your life. In this clip, Farfour blames the Jews for forcing him to cheat on his test, citing that his home had been destroyed by them and that he had lost all his notebooks as a result, to which Sarah adds that they are wicked people, but it's still no excuse to cheat.
يا فرفور صحهم يا أصحاب سوء، لكن هدم البيت مش يعني حجة مش مبرر إنه يغش في الامتحان.
Meanwhile, Uncle Hazim then goes on to say that they must study for their exams because the Jews don't want them to learn. Much like Farfour mimicking the AK-47, this would go on to become one of the show's first viral moments, as this particular clip would spread around the internet, shocking and outraging viewers across the globe. And with this came intense media scrutiny, with even the supporters of Palestine coming forward to condemn the show's messaging, along with the approach they had to such a young audience, especially by hijacking such a beloved character like Mickey Mouse. The whole thing clearly went way too far. So far, in fact, that the Palestinian government, the section not run by Hamas, ordered that the show be pulled from the air, as even they believed that it was quote-unquote the wrong approach. It was now creating an international outrage, considering that it was very clearly trying to teach children to hate Israel. But despite the direct order and criticism from all across the globe, the founder of the station itself would go on TV and proclaim that they were being unjustly targeted, before vowing to continue the show every Friday until their land was returned.
أن شعبنا الفلسطيني عندما رجع إلى دينه نصره الله سبحانه وتعالى وبالتالي لن نتخلى عن عقيدتنا ولن نتخلى عن إيماننا.
But despite this declaration, the challenges were far from over for the show, as just days after this, a rival political group known as Fatah would begin an armed clash with Hamas, which eventually led to the Al-Aqsa TV compound being surrounded by Fatah members and eventually seized entirely. And once in their control, Fatah would cut the broadcast and replace it with a pro-Fatah chant that would play on the network over and over again, until eventually Hamas would regain control of their building sometime later. It was truly an insane time period for the network, but believe it or not, the show had one more adversary that they would have to deal with. And this one was by far their most challenging, as they found themselves up against one of the most ruthless and powerful forces our world has ever seen: Disney, and specifically their legal team. During this time, the company had become aware of the show and their use of a Mickey Mouse-like character, with Walt Disney's own daughter coming out and condemning the program, calling it pure evil, with there more than likely having been legal threats lobbied against the show, as not only were they illegally using this character, but they were using him to spread anti-Semitism. It was blatant copyright infringement, and knowing the power that Disney had, there was simply no fighting them, and the showrunners knew that they had to address this issue before Disney dropped the hammer. Which leads us to Season 1, Episode 5, the likely premature finale to the very first season of the show, where they would handle the copyright issue of Farfour in what was probably the worst way imaginable, leading to by far the most infamous moment in Tomorrow's Pioneers history. In the episode titled Farfour and the Jew, Farfour is speaking to his grandfather, who shares the story of his people and the land they once owned, and in his mind still did, even going as far as pulling out a key and documents to the land.
لما ترجع للبلاد بتفتح فيها فرفور. هذا يا جدي المفتاح. هذا المفتاح. هذا المفتاح. هذا كمان وراك. تثبت كمان الأرض إلنا فرفور. هذا أمانة معك فرفور. اوعى تفرط بالأرض ده فرفور.
Though after handing Farfour the documents, this happens.
يا جدي ما تخافش. أنا يا فرفور تعبان كتير. لا يا جدي. حاسس حالي بدي أموت. لا يا جدي. حاسس حالي إني قريب من أرض الربيع. أتمنى يا جدي إنك تحافظ عليها. حاضر يا جدي. أنا جدي. أنا جدي. لا يا جدي. أنا جدي. 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 جدي حبيبي. حملني على الأمانة الكبيرة. وأنا مش عارف قديش بدنا نتحرر عن البلاد من جلد اليهود المجرمين المقتزمين اللي قتلوا جدي وقتلوا كل الدنيا.
This was a far heavier way of broaching this topic than the show had used before, as this time they were directly targeting the emotions of the children watching at home, as they're now seeing their favorite character crying on his dead relative before promising that he will liberate their land. And things only get worse from here, as the video cuts to a title screen that read, "Farfour is interrogated." Here, we see Farfour being interviewed by an Israeli official who demands that he give up the key and the documents which his late grandfather had given him, even offering large sums of money.
اقعد حبيبي فرفور اقعد ارتاح. بديش اقعد. اقعد حبيبي فرفور. يا فرفور طيب هاني بتقعد. احكي لي شو بدك. سمعنا فرفور انه سيدك اعطاك مفاتيح الارض والوراق. مين قال لك هذا الكلام؟ انت ما إلك مين قال فرفور. لكن المطلوب فرفور. طيب وايش المطلوب هذاك مني؟ المطلوب فرفور انه تعطينا اوراق الارض. اوراق الارض اللي جدي اعطاني اياهم امانه عشان احافظ عليهم وعشان احرر فيهم القدس وحرر لما تتحرر الاراضي انا واصدقائي نروح على ارضنا ونقعد فيها. انت اعطيك اياها انت. جدي ما قال لي اعطيك اياها. فرفور بدنا نشتري الارض. شري يا فرفور بدنا نديك مصاري كتير. بدك تاخد مصاري كتير فرفور وناخد الأوراق فرفور. أوراق ولا حاجة فرفور.
Though, as preached by Farfour before, he didn't surrender, which the officer didn't take kindly to.
مش احنا اللي بنبيع أراضينا لناس إرهابيين. فرفور. نعم. بدك تجيب الأوراق يعني بدك تجيب الأوراق. مش سايب الأوراق ومش سايب الأوراق. فرفور. نعم. مش سايب لك الأوراق. بدك تجيب الأوراق فرفور. بدك تجيب الأوراق فرفور. خلاص بدك الأوراق. بدك تجيبه يعني بدك تجيبه فرفور. مش سايبه لناس مجرمين. لناس أنتال. لناس إرهابية. إحنا أنتال. إحنا إرهابية فرفور. خد.
The scene ends with Farfour being attacked by the officer before the show fades back to Sarah. And if that wasn't crazy enough, this is what she had to say about the outcome of that beating.
نعم أحبابنا الأطفال، لقد فقدنا أعز صديق لنا، فرفور. لقد استشهد فرفور وهو يدافع عن أرضه، يدافع عن أرض آبائه وأجداده. استشهد على أيدي المجرمين القتلة، قتلة الأطفال الأبرياء.
In a show made for preschoolers, they quite literally kill their most beloved character right before our eyes, as he was literally beaten to death. It's easy to see the message they were going for with this episode, and I can imagine how effective it was at spreading Hamas's ideology, as just picture how traumatic it would be to watch this as a child, and watch as your favorite character is just murdered. I mean, that's comparable to kids in the US watching Barney, and all of a sudden he's detained and killed by someone like a North Korean official. I mean, it's no wonder that this moment has since gone on to become a classic meme, as it is just so bizarre in both a comical and horrifying way, seeing what essentially equates to Mickey Mouse being beaten to death. And for most, this moment is by far the highlight of the show, or the lowlight depending on who you're asking, with many likely being completely unaware that the program actually continued running without Farfour for 3 more seasons, and seasons that by far account for the majority of the show's most disturbing moments. And on the topic of disturbing moments, there was actually one more scene that I was able to find here at the last minute that is by far the darkest in all of season 1. It's fairly obscure, to the point that I wasn't fully able to determine what episode it was from, but based on how Sarah is dressed, it seemingly came from the very first episode. The scene depicts another call-in section where the hosts press a young girl about what she is willing to sacrifice to take back the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a world-famous mosque that was taken from the Palestinians by the hand of Israel, in which the entire station itself was named after.
سنابل انت شو حتعملي يعني من أجل الأقصى؟ شو حتفدي يعني روحك من أجل الأقصى؟ شو حتعملي؟
حطخ. ايش هنعمل يعني؟ كيف احنا بدنا يا سنابل نحرر؟ بدنا نقاوم. وبعدين؟ هذا حفظناها وبعدين؟
احنا بدنا تقومنا اليهود. احنا بدنا ندافع عن الأقصى بأرواحنا وبدمائنا، ولا لا يا سنابل؟ لا تستسلم.
Here, this little girl, who is no more than 8 or 9 years old, expresses her desire not only to fight, but to annihilate the Jews, while closing the segment by stating how she will commit martyrdom. Or in other words, she was going to give up her life to fight for this cause, which, as mentioned prior, Hamas would often do by means of suicide bombing. And though most of the show to this point can easily be laughed off, it's moments like this where things take a much scarier turn, as the show's true intentions begin to reveal themselves. And as we move forward into season 2, these moments only became more prevalent.
You are seeing it here exclusively first. Farfour is dead.
With season 1 in the books, the impact that Tomorrow's Pioneers had in the span of just a few episodes can't be overstated. The show immediately became the most popular kids program in the region, with children anywhere from the ages of 3 to 4, all the way up to 12 and 13 years old, tuning in religiously each Friday. And given how unavoidable its main themes are, it's likely that the anti-Semitism it was preaching was in fact resonating with its viewers. In fact, many critics of the show were going so far as to claim that it was outright brainwashing its viewers to not only hate Israelis, but to commit acts of violence against them.
Instead of being entertained, they're being indoctrinated.
And at the end of the day, I don't think Hamas was even trying to hide this either. But following the death of Farfour, all eyes were on the show, with the whole world wondering, what will they do next? How could they replace this beloved character that had brought the show so much infamy? Well, given time constraints and Al-Aqsa TV's desire to air the program every Friday, the truth is that they were unprepared to replace Farfour, and the following week, the show was forced to start season 2 without a co-host for Sarah. The episode was titled Sarah and the Hadith, and unfortunately, practically all of the episode is currently missing, with the exception of one short clip, as it shows us yet another call-in section and yet another instance of anti-Semitism.
يقول الحجر والشجر يا مسلم يا عبد الله تعال وراء يهودي فقاتله.
Immediately after this episode aired, the creators of the show realized that they needed something else to appeal to the children. The show was just not the same without Farfour, as it seemingly lost both its shock factor as well as its entertainment factor, making the whole product immediately less interesting. And so, in Season 2, Episode 2, the creators of the show would come together and create a plan. As though Farfour was gone for good, there was one other character that they could turn to. His cousin.
من أنت؟ ومن أين جئت؟
أنا نحول.
ومن نحول؟
أنا نحول من عم فرفور.
وماذا تريد؟
أريد أن أواصل مشوار ابن عمي فرفور.
وكيف تريد أن تواصل؟
أريد أن أكون في كل حلقة معكم في برنامج رواد الغد كما كان فرفور.
This is Nahul the Bee, and much as he desired within this video, he would become the show's new co-host, just like his cousin Farfour. And on the topic of Farfour, Nahul vehemently praised him and vowed not only to continue in his footsteps with tomorrow's pioneers, but also he wanted to follow his path to martyrdom. And not only did he express his desire for this to happen to him, but he also mentions how all of his friends should follow in these footsteps as well, with his friends likely referring to the young children watching at home, providing what almost feels like a call to action for the young viewers. Episode 3, titled Nahul's Rant, only offers us a small snippet of surviving video, but it's still enough to get the basic gist. The premise was simple. Essentially, it was just a lengthy monologue performed by Nahul, as he tells the children that we will all liberate Al-Aqsa, while using some choice words and further pulling at the emotions of the viewers at home.
نعم سنحرر أقصانا من دنس اليهود المجرمين الذين قتلوا جدي وقتلوا فرفور.
The episode also has a call-in section where a child expresses his desire to become a journalist one day, to which Nahul says,
احنا بحاجة يا نحول إلى صحفيين وإلى
لكي يصورون اليهود وهم يقتلون فرفور والأطفال الصغار.
نعم يا نحول
ونحن كلنا مجاهدون
بإذن الله.
The video then ends with Nahul shouting, "We are all jihad warriors, Allah willing." Nahul's big day out. This is by far one of the show's most unusual episodes, which is really saying something. The program starts out with Nahul and Sarah discussing their desire to occupy Al-Aqsa.
الأقصى يا أصدقائي ينتظركم أنتم. الأقصى يا أحبابي حزين جدا. الأقصى أصدقائي أسير ومحاصر من قتلة الأطفال المجرمين. يجب علينا أن ننهض لكي ننتقم له من اليهود المجرمين الصهاينة المحتلين. يجب أن نحرر الأقصى.
To which Nahul explains how he believes they can achieve this.
نعم أتعلمين كيف سنحرره ونأخذ مفتاحه كما حرره صلاح الدين؟
كيف يا نحول؟
نعم كيف؟ بصلاة الفجر.
نعم.
وبالدم والشوق والتضحية بالآلام بالشهداء والصبر. وهذا هو المفتاح يا سراء.
This may be the show's darkest moment yet, as Nahul directly calls out the children watching and says that the only way they will regain control of Al-Aqsa is by means of morning prayers, blood, sacrifice, and pain, further elaborating a few seconds later by saying that the key to all of this is by using means of martyrs. Sarah then attempts to calm Nahul down by telling him that the children, the pioneers of tomorrow, will do what it takes to regain control of Al-Aqsa, which, as stated before, will require martyrdom.
لا تحزن يا نحول، فأنا وأنت وأحبابنا الأطفال بل الكبار جيل رواد الغد بإذن الله تعالى سنعيد المسجد الأقصى وسنطهره من دنس الصهاينة يا نحول إن شاء الله.
It really feels like the whole show up until this point was leading to this moment, a direct call to action, essentially conditioning and then asking these children to martyr themselves, something that was first hinted at, then heavily implied, and now expressly stated. I mean, they are literally asking their child viewers to sacrifice their lives. And as mentioned prior, Hamas's most notable way of martyring themselves is by means of suicide bombing, leading to some arguing that the show is expressly telling these kids that they should become suicide bombers. However, though it always ends the same, martyrdom does come in many different forms, so for now, let's leave this as a working theory, as it will come up again later. But surprisingly, the episode didn't even end there, with the rest being dedicated to a fun trip that Nahul had at the zoo, which is where things devolve into complete chaos. I'm not actually sure how much YouTube will let me show of this, but Nahul enters an exhibit filled with cats and proceeds to instantly start abusing them. And the abuse isn't all that horrible when you watch it, but it's definitely enough to cause discomfort to the animals at the very least. And things progress from there, as Nahul then visits a cage with 2 lions in it and proceeds to start throwing rocks at them. It is just the strangest thing that I have ever seen, and the justification for it is even stranger, as ultimately, Sarah sits Nahul down after the fact and scolds him for his behavior.
ما هذا الذي فعلته يا نحول؟ ألم تسمع بالحديث الشريف الذي قاله الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم يعني قال بما معناه يعني أنه دخلت امرأة النار في هرة حبستها فلا هي أطعمتها ولا هي تركتها يعني أيضا يعني الله عاقبها بالنار يا نحول وهذا كان مصيرها وإن بقيت على هذا الحال فسيكون مصيرك.
And that is how the episode ends. So their message is to not abuse animals or you will go to hell, while quite literally going out and abusing animals themselves for the show. It just almost doesn't feel real how unusual it is, and certainly there would have been better ways to tell this message. Strangely enough, despite the showrunners at one point promising a new episode of Tomorrow's Pioneers each Friday, there's actually a 6-month gap in between episodes 4 and 5, with the show either having gone off the air or the episodes having gone unarchived, which is probably the more likely explanation. And if anything were to have aired between these episodes, then it seems to be currently lost, and for that reason, I'll still be referring to this as episode 5. Titled Nahul and Sarah's Feast of the Sacrifice Extravaganza, this installment shows the 2 co-hosts celebrating the Feast of Sacrifice, though Nahul seems to be in no mood for the celebration. And of all the shocking moments in the show's run, nothing surprised me more than when I heard Nahul speak in this clip.
أنت أيضا لا تريد أن تهنئ بمناسبة عيد الأضحى المبارك؟
أهنئ يا سراء؟
نعم.
أهنئ مين؟ ولا مين يا سراء؟ أهنئ أخويا استشهد في الانتفاضة القديمة من اليهود الصهاينة، ولا هنئ أخويا الثاني اللي استشهد في الانتفاضة الثانية، ولا هنئ أخويا الجريح، ولا هنئ خالتي اللي استشهدت من الحصار، ولا هنئ الأيتام، ولا هنئ مين ولا مين يا سراء؟ أنا مش مهنئ حدا، أنا زعلان يا سراء. ماما اللي معها مرض السكري، ولا أهنئ بابا اللي معاه مرض الكبد الوبائي سي.
For some reason, in this episode and this episode only, Nahul had a different voice actor, and rather than having his signature high-pitched voice, he literally just sounds like a normal guy, and he even breaks character at one point to laugh at a child calling in.
والعجل رحنا بدنا نذبحه لقيناه ايش؟ ميت. ايش نسوي؟
بتشتري خروف.
طب وإذا معنا
وإذا ما معهم؟
وإذا معناش مصاري؟
It is just so weird. But in terms of the actual content, Nahul is upset during the celebration as he feels like he has nothing to be thankful for, given that all of his family is either dead or ailing. Before the episode is then closed out with a song by Sarah, featuring lyrics that again glorifies martyrdom by saying, "We will meet our death with no hesitation, award your victory to those who sacrifice themselves. This is your wedding, O martyr." From here, the show would again go off the air, this time for a little over a month, and with this absence, there was actually a very reasonable explanation that yet again involves Fatah. In early January of 2008, Fatah would once again target Hamas and specifically Al-Aqsa TV, this time by kidnapping 4 members of their staff, leading to things shutting down yet again, before the men would eventually be returned. But following the show's absence, it would be revealed that during this break, the show's creators had been brewing up something special. Yet another plot twist that would end season 2 and leave its fans completely at a loss.
مش قادر. طب انا ايش اعمل؟ لك شعر طويل وانت عيان، ورحنا عرضناك على العريش وما طلعش بدنا نمرقك على مصر تعمل العمليه. في اطفال فلسطين وهم بيموتوا.
The episode begins with Nahul in a hospital having fallen deathly ill. His mother explains how they tried to transfer him to Egypt to receive some sort of medical attention, but Israel denied their entry, and with there being no proper treatment available in Palestine, Nahul eventually stops breathing. Picturing the children watching this at home, I almost think that this death is somehow more depressing than Farfour's, as the way the doctors are desperately trying to resuscitate Nahul until he just passes away has gotta be so upsetting for a child to see. Although, unlike the death that ended season 1, the tone of this episode was far different, as rather than being upset at the loss of her co-host, Sarah is instead more proud than anything.
نقول لك يا نحول يعني مبارك يعني عرسك يا نحول. نحن لا نحسبه يعني موت لك يا نحول بل نحسبه عرس لك يا نحول.
And this strange emotional roller coaster continues from here as we are immediately introduced to a brand new character, Nahul's brother, a rabbit named Asud, who we are shown receiving the news that Nahul was no longer alive.
قول يا امي وين نحول؟ زمان انا ما شفته. واصل مشوار وعنده اجا، وصل مشوار وعنده اجا ان شاء الله. بتأخرش. وصل في الليل هيك مشاوير كيف طالعين؟ ما انت شايفه الوضع. امال ما ايش بدي انا اعمل؟ عنده بيجي ان شاء الله. بابا. نعم يا بابا. وين نحول؟ احنا المستشفى نضلنا نخبر على نحول. يا بابا. انت انسان مؤمن وربنا سبحانه وتعالى. يا بابا. ومرض يعني وعي عيني. ايوه في المستشفى وانا في المستشفى يا بابا. لا مش في المستشفى والله يابا ما هو في المستشفى. نحول ربنا سبحانه وتعالى استشهد نحول. لا يا بابا والله استشهد نحول. الله يرحمه الله يرحمه الله يرحمه.
Asud then vows to take the place of his fallen brother as well as Farfour as the brand new host of tomorrow's pioneers.
زي ما فرفور استشهد ومسك بداله نحول، أنا كمان حكون خلف نحول
إن شاء الله
إن شاء رب العالمين، وادخل البسمة والفرحة في أطفال فلسطين، أطفال العالم أجمع.
With the rabbit then taking his new spot alongside Sarah and closing the show with this discussion.
نعم يا أسود، سنمضي على ذات درب نحول وسنمضي على ذات درب فرفور بإذنه تعالى، ولن نخيب آملهما بإذنه تعالى.
إن شاء الله
يا أسود،
وكلنا يا سراء مشاريع برضو الشهادة، صح ولا لا؟
أكيد يا أسود، بإذنه تعالى كلنا فداء الوطن، سنفدي كل ما بوسعنا وكل ما بروحنا من أجل الوطن يا أسود.
The scene gives us a number of disturbing lines like we are all martyrdom seekers at the end of the day, and we are all ready to sacrifice ourselves for the sake of our homeland. And these lines are made even darker, as just moments before, Sarah was praising Nahul's passing and glorifying it as some sort of wedding as opposed to actual death, essentially conditioning these kids into believing that martyrdom is a good thing. But by far this episode's most disturbing moment, and the show's darkest yet, comes immediately following these lines referencing martyrdom.
يا سراء حابب أسألك سؤال.
ما هو؟
قديش عدد جنود رواد الغد؟
يا أسود، جنود رواد الغد هم كثر 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 يا أسود.
حمدا لله حمدا لله.
نعم، وبإذنه تعالى سيساعدوننا في تحرير وطننا فلسطين بإذنه تعالى يا أسود.
وأنا وأنت يا سراء سنكون أول ناس، صح ولا لا؟
بإذنه تعالى يا أسود.
وسنأخذ الأقصى.
Together, Asud and Sarah, the host of this show, again literally made for children, with Sarah herself being only 9 years old, discuss how they wish to be the first of the Tomorrow's Pioneers family to martyr themselves, so that they can lead the way for their viewers to follow in their footsteps. And if this wasn't twisted enough, the show ends with Asud reciting yet another one of the show's most infamous lines, providing a chilling end to this incredibly eventful season.
انت ليش اسمك أسود وانت شكلك أرنوب؟
لأنه يا هالة الأرنوب دايما إنسان إيش؟ مش كويس، صح ولا لا؟ وإنسان جبان، لكن أنا أسود إن شاء الله اللي حخوف اليهود وأقول لهم أكل إن شاء الله رب العالمين، صح ولا لا؟
بإذنه تعالى.
The language in this final episode is truly shocking, as with each episode, its creators were pushing the boundaries further and further, and as the content became darker as a result, the show only grew in popularity among the kids of Palestine, which was incredibly worrisome, as Season 2's entire premise was seemingly centered around martyrdom, going as far as to ask the children to follow their lead and lay down their lives for their country. But how effective could this really be? Would watching this program actually convince children to join the fight? Well, I would say undoubtedly, yes. Think about it. Season 1 basically laid the groundwork for anti-Semitism. It gave the children an enemy and a reason to be angry, while Season 2 and its glorification of martyrdom provided the kids with an outlet for that anger. It gave them a way to address the enemy that would not only help reclaim their land, but also make them a celebrated member of their community. I mean, it's so disturbing to even consider, but by this point of the show, I think it's more than fair to question if the entire program was created not only to breed anti-Semitism, but also to breed martyrs, willing to give their lives for Hamas at the age of just 4 or 5 years old. Given just how popular the show was and how impressionable children are at that young age, the national media continued its criticism against the show, with many being outright convinced that this theory was true, and that the whole thing was essentially breeding terrorists. And as we continue on to Season 3, the show would only provide its critics with more fuel.
Evil stuff. You've got a children's character saying, "I will eat the Jews," Allah willing.
Beginning on February 8th, 2008, just 1 week after Season 2's conclusion, Season 3 would start with many discrepancies over whether or not this infamous eating Jews segment came from this episode or the episode prior, And due to this confusion, there's actually no footage that I can find that was confirmed to have come from this episode. But according to an incredibly brief overview of the episode, it was supposedly titled Asud's Story, and it revealed that Asud had actually come from Egypt and was allowed to enter Gaza the month prior due to the Gaza fence having been breached. A song was then later played that featured the line, "We will never recognize Israel until we liberate our homeland from the Zionist filth." The show continued the next Friday with the release of episode 2, titled Asud vs. Denmark. The entire episode was a direct response to a cartoonist named Kurt Westergaard, a Danish artist who had published artwork containing offensive depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, which was considered to be blasphemy. In response, Tomorrow's Pioneers put out this program, condemning his acts and calling for a boycott of all goods from Denmark.
أكيد كلنا سوف نقاطع المنتجات الدنماركية وأيضا قبلها المنتجات الإسرائيلية يا أماني.
During the show, multiple children call in and further drive this point home, while expressing their frustration and anger at the man.
ولعن الله هؤلاء الكفرة الضالين. نحن هنا من جند رواد الغد نقول لك عذرا.
Before Sarah proclaims that they will avenge their prophet by directly threatening the Danes.
أنا أقول لهم أنتم لم تروا شيئا فجند رواد الغد بإذنه تعالى سيفدون الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم بكل ما يملكون فسيفدونه بكل دمائهم أيضا يا أسود ولن يسمحوا لهم.
To which Asud says this.
بأن يعيدوا الكرة من جديد يا أسود.
طب لو عادوها يا سراء إن شاء الله حنقتلهم صح ولا لا؟ حنضعضهم وناكلهم صح ولا لا؟
نعم
إن شاء الله.
Following this lofty threat by Asud, Sarah then goes on to explain how these words don't make them terrorists, somehow bringing things back to the fact that they just want their land back.
أسود نحن لسنا إرهابيون، نحن فقط نريد أن يرجع لنا وطننا الحبيب فلسطين، نريد أن تكون كل فلسطين لنا يا أسود، نحن لسنا إرهابيون
لأنها هي إلنا من الأول صح يا سراء؟
As stated before, it seemed with each passing episode the creators were upping their shock value, but now they were stooping down to the point where their co-host is literally saying that he will kill people if there were any more offensive depictions of Muhammad. And the episode doesn't even end there, as they yet again bring the conversation back to martyrdom, to which Asud predicts his own martyrdom, and then asks Sarah,
إن شاء الله أنا اللي بدي أظبط الوضع ومش هيجي وإن شاء الله أنا وياك رواد الغد احنا اللي هنحقق ان شاء الله الحلم هذا اللي مين بده يقدم البرنامج لو انت استشهدت يعني 100,000 سراء بدك ان شاء الله
بإذنه تعالى يا أسود.
ناخذ من ثأر رواد الغد ان شاء الله
بإذنه تعالى. هناك آلاف جند رواد الغد.
هذه الأمنية تاعتنا ان شاء الله الشهادة في سبيل الله صح ولا لا؟
نعم.
The whole thing is just insanely twisted, as Asud states that martyrdom for Muhammad is what we are all hoping for, including all of the fans of Tomorrow's Pioneers. And believe it or not, it keeps going from here, as this is one of the most content-rich episodes to date, as the co-hosts proceed to take another call-in, where they ask a child what they would do to Kurt Westergaard.
بحكي لهم كلهم إنه مهما حاولوا يخبوا مهما حاول يتخبى رح نقدر نطوله ورح نقدر نغتاله.
بإذنه تعالى.
إن شاء الله اللي حيزينه كمان إن شاء الله.
And the show finally comes to an end with Asud showing a picture of the actual cartoonist after everyone on the show was already threatening him, before continuing to insult him.
الرسام الذي أساء للرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم من خلال رسمه.
أنا بقدر أقول ما شاء الله هي أنت قلتيها اللي هو ازعجش عليه إلا يا مجرم يا حقير يا حثالة إن شاء الله هيجي عليك يوم وتندم على اللي فعلته.
Clearly, this is one of the more emotionally charged episodes we've seen yet, as they truly held nothing back, straight up threatening the cartoonist on so many occasions with no subtlety whatsoever. And interestingly, there would actually be an assassination attempt against Kurt Westergaard.
Broke into Westergaard's home last night wielding an axe and a knife and shouting he wanted to kill him.
Though it wasn't related in any way to the show's audience. Not only was this episode a key point to the show's history, as it was perhaps its most violent installment yet, it was also important for another reason. Following the episode's release, a statement would be made in the United States House of Representatives by a member named Joseph Crowley, no relation to me by the way, who actually submitted a resolution to the House condemning Tomorrow's Pioneers and the effects that it could have on the children of Palestine by stating The House of Representatives condemns Hamas for using a children's television program to incite hatred, violence, and anti-Semitism towards Israel, and demands that Hamas immediately suspend all television programs of that nature, while further going on to reference characters like Farfour and Assoud, calling him a Bugs Bunny ripoff, and outright stating that the show was teaching children a terroristic doctrine. Through all the criticisms that Tomorrow's Pioneers had faced, this was the first time that it was seemingly taken before the United States government, who would then go as far as to label Al-Aqsa TV themselves a terrorist organization and demand that Tomorrow's Pioneers be ended. And as a response, the show seemingly went off the air for nearly 2 more months, with many believing that that was the end of Tomorrow's Pioneers. But apparently, the threat of the United States government wasn't enough to permanently shut them down, and on May 9th, 2008, the show would make its return. The episode was titled Assoud's History Lesson, and shows the rabbit visiting his only surviving grandfather, the other having passed away in the hands of Farfour, as he's given a lesson about the history of their land.
انا لسه عندي الوراق وعندي الثبوتيات وعندي كل الورق وهي الاوراق انا معايا وهي كمان كل الحاجات من عهد بريطانيا وقبلها هذا ارض.
All in all, it's a pretty unmemorable episode that essentially just acts as a history lesson for the kids. The season would continue with episode 4, Assoud Steals, and contrary to the episode prior, this one proves to be one of the most memorable of all time, as yes, there are some particularly disturbing moments, but all in all, it's just more strange than anything, as we are taken to the room of Assoud's grandfather, as the bunny sneaks in with the intent of stealing his money. Before the money is actually taken, Assoud makes the noble decision not to steal from his grandfather, or at least at first he does, until he is confronted by Satan himself.
وين ايش بدك تسوي يا اسود؟ ايش بدك تسوي يا اسود؟ لا يا اسود انا وعدتك انه فيش حدا حيعرف ولا حيشوف. خذ ورقتين يا 3 ما تخافش ما تخافش يا اسود ما تخافش. خلص انا حاخذ ورقه وبس انا حاخذ لك ورقتي لا خذ 3 خذ 3.
And the way that Satan is depicted here, with him being like half the size of Assoud, is just so funny, as this is probably the least threatening Satan that I have ever seen in my life. But regardless, Assoud is convinced by him to steal, for which he is then chastised by the callers of the show. And this isn't your typical criticism, as the callers wanted Assoud to pay the price for his sin, to which they propose a particularly gruesome punishment. As punishment for his crime, every single call-in guest demands that Assoud have his hand chopped off, and Sarah agrees, even proposing that they instead chop off one of his ears, only to quickly backtrack and give the rabbit another chance.
طيب يا نور في رأيك نقطع يد أسود الآن؟
إذا سرق تاب وشكر الله واستغفر إنه ما يعيدهاش تاني خلاص.
طيب إذا ما قطعنا له يده هل نقطع له أذنه؟
But as it would later turn out, Assoud would get his karma after all, as following this episode, an event would transpire that no one could have seen coming.
the sheer power of Israel's airstrikes. The country's air force continues to turn Palestinian targets to rubble. Targets like this one, the Hamas-run Al-Aqsa television station.
On December 29th, 2008, Al-Aqsa TV station would be completely destroyed by Israeli missiles. As with the added context of just how dark the network's programs were and are, you can understand a bit more why the show's headquarters became such a target. Though despite many not seeing the attack coming, Al-Aqsa TV had.
This was supposed to be a fatal blow to the network, but staff had already been evacuated.
And they had scattered their station across Gaza to various anonymous spots just before the missiles had struck, meaning that despite losing their home, Tomorrow's Pioneers lived on. But despite the show itself surviving the attack, the same couldn't be said for its host. In the fifth and final episode of Season 3, Asud reveals that he had been inside the building collecting artifacts from the show before the missiles had struck.
أنا العدو الصهيوني غدار ويقتل كل شيء، ولكن كنت لا أفكر أنه سيقصف في طاية الأقصى والقصص والحكايات التي كانت ملك أطفال فلسطين.
And as he talks, he begins to fall weaker and weaker.
لازم توسع أحلامنا الأطفال إنه ما ينسى القدس والأقصى والأسرى واللاجئين، وذكريهم يا سراء بصمود المقاومة والمجاهدين، وقولي لهم إنه أسود مات بطل، مات شهيد، مات شهيد يا سراء، مات شهيد يا سراء. سامحيني يا سراء، أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله، وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله.
أسود؟ أسود؟ لا يا أسود، لا تمت يا أسود.
Much like the other animal co-hosts had done in every single season finale before, Asud would pass away, leading to this closing monologue by Sarah.
النصر قريب، سيكبر جند رواد الغد إن شاء الله. سنمضي على ذات الدرب وسننهج النهج إن شاء الله. سننهج علماء وأدباء مبدعون ومفكرون. سنحرر ترابك يا فلسطين إن شاء الله. سنحرره من دنس الصهاينة. سنطهره إن شاء الله.
And that is how Season 3 would come to an end. First Farfour, then Nahul, and now Asud, all dead due to the supposed wrongdoings of Israel. And the effect of Asud's death was perhaps the most emotionally charged for children at home, as he was said to have become a particularly beloved icon in the region, and one that the kids just absolutely adored, due to his far more blunt approach to topics, and specifically violence. But now, he was gone. And with no home for tomorrow's pioneers, and now knowing that the station had a target on its back, the show had reached yet another crossroads, and perhaps its most uncertain hour yet. And adding insult to injury, Fatah would once again emerge as an adversary to Hamas, but this time in a different way, as they had taken the opportunity to launch their own show on their own network in the region. And the show was basically just an exact ripoff of Tomorrow's Pioneers that would instantly become the show's direct competition, taking a large slice of their viewership. But it seems that whenever this show was backed up against a wall, it would always find a way to persist. And after just a few weeks, the Gaza war would come to an end, and taking advantage of the ceasefire, the crew of the show would quickly reestablish themselves in a brand new building. And before long, Tomorrow's Pioneers was back for its fourth and evidently final season. Starting on February 13th, 2009, the show was entering new territory. They had always had a target on their back, but now they realized the threat of just how serious their words were becoming, which is where we get into a personal theory of mine. Looking back on the death of Asud, something he said within his dying words had always stuck out to me.
وأنت تعلمين يا سراء أن فضائية الأقصى يوجد فيها قسم خاص للأطفال يأتون الأطفال دائما في هذا القسم.
Asud mentions how the Tamara's Pioneer set had a distinct area where children could come and play, basically equating to a daycare. But if you think this sounds like a wholesome little tidbit, I have an inclination that there may be something more sinister at play. If you think about it, advertising that there were innocent children within the building at all times that they were working essentially makes it untouchable from Israeli destruction. As if they were to bomb the building with all those innocent kids in there, well, the optics would be horrible. So it's possible that this was exactly what their thinking was behind starting a daycare within their facilities. This essentially guaranteed that Israel would never just straight up destroy the building without warning, as even during the 2008 attack, Israel had actually given them a heads up that they would be destroying the building, providing more than enough time to evacuate the kids who stayed there, with this heads up being the only reason that the Tomorrow's Pioneers crew were able to escape. And for Season 4, immediately following this bombing, they would take things a step further, as in every episode from here on out, the show would feature a group of random innocent kids who would not only be allowed on set, but would also be sitting on stage with the hosts at all times. Again, this makes it an impossible target to just randomly attack, and considering the timing of it all, with it having started practically right after the building was destroyed, it all just seems like too much of a coincidence. And this new format wasn't the only new addition for the season, as with Asud having passed away, we would soon be introduced to the show's fourth and final co-host. This is Nasur, a bear that had supposedly entered the Gaza Strip after the recent war had ended, and he had come to take the place of Asud. Unlike the other characters, he seemingly didn't get a grand introduction, or perhaps it just wasn't archived, but he did share his reasoning for coming to the area. Nasur starts his run on the show by immediately declaring war on the Zionists. And not only was he declaring war, but he included his 10-year-old co-host as well. And though it's nothing too shocking, at least in comparison to what we've already seen, this would lay the groundwork for the darkest season of the show's run by far. Episode 2, titled Sarah's Song, unfortunately doesn't have the best archived version available, but I was able to find a news report that features at least some of the video, with commentary over the top.
This video is airing on the Hamas-run television station, appearing while children are home on summer recess. The dialogue encourages parents to, quote, teach the children that their death will bring glory and victory. Critics argue that Hamas has left no doubt about what it seeks to teach Palestinian children.
Using the Star of David as a dartboard and telling parents to help them teach their kids that they should be willing to sacrifice their lives is pretty on brand for what you would expect from Tomorrow's Pioneers at this point. But that doesn't make it any less disturbing, as it seems that with each mention of martyrdom, the show's approach becomes more and more blunt, almost as if it's conditioning kids to get used to this idea. And by this point, our theory about the show being created to lead kids to martyrdom seems to be all but confirmed, as you may have noticed that they had even began straight up referring to the children as soldiers. Following this, the show would continue to air each Friday, though many of these episodes would go unarchived. However, I was able to find a few clips, like this one, where we see Nasur surrounded by children on stage.
تخورة حاجات
يا حرام انت ايش بتقولي لهم بدك تضربيهم؟
Though this is nothing compared to a segment that was shown a week prior, in yet another unlabeled episode.
نعم أحبابنا الأطفال وإن شاء الله منصير كبار زيهم منصير شهداء. نعم وطبعا حيحرر الأقصى يا سراء روادي وجد.
Before a child calls in to sing this song for the group.
طيب سحبت سركينة سحبت تنشدي لنا.
لما نستشهد
تفضلي.
تفضلي. يلا حيوها تزقفوا معها. يلا ويتم دايما. يلا.
لا 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 لما نستشهد من روح الجنة، لما نستشهد من روح الجنة، لا تقول علينا صغار، من هالعيشة زين أكبر، من غير فلسطين شو يعني طفولة، من غير فلسطين شو يعني طفولة، لو يعطونا الدنيا وما لا ما تنسينا لا لا دو ذنبي كلمة لا، من غير فلسطين شو يعني طفولة.
In what feels like the most dystopian moment of the show yet, a group of children sit together and sing a song about martyrdom and how their lives are meaningless without Palestine. And if this isn't a direct admission as to what the show was trying to do, and proof that it was in fact working, then I don't know what is. But as dark as this moment may seem, it would all pale in comparison to what the show had planned next. Episode 3, Nasur and the Children of Reupload. This is the big one, the sole reason that I even decided to make this video, as it was my initial glimpse into how truly disturbed the show was. And of all the episodes I've seen and the year I've spent researching this topic, this is the darkest moment in the show's history. In this episode, Nasur and Sarah spend a day on set with a group of children, 2 of which belonging to a famous woman named Reupload, who in their words was a hero. And what exactly did this famous hero do? Well, on January 14th, 2004, she entered an area known as the Erez Crossing, essentially a heavily guarded border crossing point between Israel and Gaza City. And when waiting for security to allow her to cross, she would then detonate an explosive strapped to her body, killing her and 4 Israelis instantly. And in a videotaped message taken before the attack, she would state, "I wanted to be the first woman to carry out a martyrdom operation, where parts of my body can fly all over. God has given me 2 children. I love them with a kind of love that only God knows, but my love to meet God is stronger." And now, those 2 children were sitting here on stage with Nasur and Sarah. But what was the purpose of this episode? What did they actually do with the kids? Well, for some reason, they decided it would be a good idea to show these young children a reenactment of the day their own mother had taken her life, with the video recreating her final moments, as well as the moment that she exploded. The whole thing is just the craziest piece of media I have ever seen in my life, with the lyrics of the song played in the background being the icing on the cake, as it tells the story from the perspective of one of her children, asking their mother why they are carrying a bomb instead of them in their arms, and finishing it off by saying, "Only now I know what was more precious than us." But it gets even more disturbing following the explosion. So not only were the children themselves shown a reenactment of their mother dying right before their eyes, but the same video shows an actor portraying the daughter and vowing to follow in her mother's footsteps. It is just so horrible, especially for this young girl, who now, regardless of her thoughts and feelings, likely feels that she has to follow in her mother's path and martyr herself. And the show continues briefly from here, as Sarah states,
أبناء الشهيدة المجاهدة البطلة التي صراحة يعني ضحت بكل ما عندها من أجل وطنها ولم تأبه يعني هم فلذات أكبادها حتى أنها ضحت في سبيل الله، ضحت من أجلهم في سبيل الله. ونحن نقول للمحتل بأننا سنظل على نهجها، على نهج الشهيدة المجاهدة ريم رياشي حتى نحرر وطننا من أيديك الغاصبة.
Sirah exclaims how they, referencing the pioneers of tomorrow, will all follow in the footsteps of Reem Raisha. And with this, it's clear that the show is not only promoting martyrdom, but it's clearly promoting martyrdom by means of suicide bombing, seemingly confirming the long-standing theory surrounding the show.
Meet the next generation of suicide bombers. She's just 4 years old and praising her mother as she goes out to blow herself up.
I just feel so awful for all the kids in this situation, and truly everything about this episode is as deranged as it could ever get. Even as dark as the show had gotten before and as many notable moments as there were, it was this moment that I truly believe to be its lowest point, and perhaps maybe even the darkest moment of any kid show ever created. But the show wasn't quite finished yet, as from here we would get episode 4 called Nasur and the Expulsion of the Jews, where the season would delve even deeper.
لا في يهود ولا في صهاينة، خلاص كلهم يكونوا مدحورين ويصير كلها زي ما بنروح على الكعبة زيارة يا سراء، يصير العالم كلهم يجوا وين الزيارة على القدس. شو بدك تسوي لليهود اللي طخوا بابا؟ ايش بدك تسوي لهم؟
بدي اقتلهم.
زي ما قتلوا بابا.
ما نسوي شيء، احنا بدنا نطردهم بس من ارضنا.
بدنا احنا نذبحهم يا سراء عشان يتشردوا من ارضنا اكيد.
ما هو بدنا يعني نطردهم من ارضنا
ما هو اذا ما ردوش بالسلام ولا بالكلمة ولا بالحدوتة لازم بالشخص.
And of all the fiery language in Tomorrow's Pioneers history, this less than a minute-long clip features some of its most appalling, as the hosts literally have an argument about whether or not all the Jews should be slaughtered, with Nasur being fully convinced that they should. And it accounts for 3 straight episodes in this season that are just completely vile, as the show by this point had gone completely mask off. But there was one quote made from a Palestinian journalist about this episode that, and okay, I know this is really messed up, but this is actually kind of funny. In response to the episode, a journalist in the area would state that the show often blended pragmatic advice with more problematic messages, but stressed that it wasn't always bad, by saying, generally, the program also transmits good messages to kids, like drinking milk or asking parents permission to do something, but we also find these very problematic messages, like the call to kill all Jews. So yeah, I guess it all evens out. The episode titled Nasur and the Language of the Enemy is considered by many sources to be the final episode of the show's run, and features just a rather lackluster clip of a child being interviewed about what he wants to be when he's older.
في المستقبل شو حبتكوني إن شاء الله؟
مدرس لغة إنجليزية.
لغة إنجليزية كتير حلو. طيب ليش بدك تصيري مدرسة لغة إنجليزية بالذات؟
عشان أعلم الأطفال لغة عدوهم.
حلو كتير ومجال كتير حلو، واحنا طبعا مش انه بس بدنا نقتصر على تعليم لغتنا احنا، لكن برضه بدنا نتعلم لغة عدونا عشان نعرف كيف نتعامل معهم.
زي انا عارف لغة العدو الصهاينة.
عن جد؟
العبرة.
طب احكي لنا.
مش عارف.
And that's about all we have of the episode. And if you think that's a rather underwhelming end to the show, I have to agree with you. In fact, I didn't even believe it myself. So I dug a bit deeper and discovered that not only was this not the actual final episode, but the end of the show itself is essentially a total mystery to this day. In my research, I was able to find multiple clips from seemingly forgotten episodes, like this one from December 5th, 2009.
والطخ، أما إحنا بنعلمها الصداقة والإخلاص والدين الإسلامي وحفظ القرآن.
And another having come exactly a month later.
نعم. كيف مضت أيام الحرب عليكي؟ كنت خايفة وخايفة إنك تموتي وخلص تروحي من الدنيا ولا؟ لا ما كنتش خايفة. كنت أتمنى الشهادة في سبيل الله تعالى. ما شاء الله. حتى يعني دعاء الطفلة صغيرة لما يتجاوز عمرها. كم عمرك يا دعاء؟ 10 سنوات.
But the last trace I could find of Tomorrow's Pioneers, and potentially its final episode ever, might actually be this clip showing the children singing about martyrdom, as I just realized after this entire video was made that this scene is actually dated a full year later than I had thought, and rather than being from April 2nd, 2009, it seems to instead be from April 2nd, 2010, a full half year after the show had supposedly ended, giving it by far the latest air date of any Tomorrow's Pioneers episode that I was able to find, meaning that this may very well be the final moment of the show. And what a fitting end this would be, as at the end of the day, this was really what the show was striving for: anger, hatred, martyrdom. And I truly think that they succeeded with this mission, and though there isn't really evidence that could ever prove this, I think that any child in the region watching this program every Friday morning would likely walk away at the very least believing that Israel is the enemy, and at most wanting to martyr themselves in retaliation against them. And that's just due to how impressionable kids are at that age, as their minds are still forming, and in many ways conforming to the world around them. And one report I read really hit home just how effective this propaganda was, as a journalist had interviewed children on the streets of Gaza and asked them to explain why they hated Israel so much, to which multiple would respond with something along the lines of, because they killed Farfour. But though this may be a fitting conclusion to at least drive home the theme of the show, I still have so many questions as to the conclusion of the show itself. Tomorrow's Pioneers was a spectacle, with every turn giving us more and more shocking moments. So many, in fact, that it inspired me to make this video, which is by far the longest of my life. Yet we're supposed to believe that it just disappeared? It just makes no sense for a show like this to leave quietly, especially considering that Nasur, well, seemingly survived. I mean, every single host had been martyred by season's end, yet Nasur had somehow avoided this fate, in what would have been not only the end of season 4, but the end of the entire show in general. It just doesn't seem on brand for the program at all. It makes me think that the end of the show was most likely unplanned. If I had to guess, I noticed that less than a month before this supposed final episode, the US would actually launch sanctions against the main bank in Gaza for the sole reason that they were funding Al-Aqsa TV, and specifically Tomorrow's Pioneers, as they believed the show was, and I quote, intended to recruit children as future armed operatives and suicide bombers. And with these sanctions, it likely forced Hamas's hand at quietly shutting the program down, as at that point they really wouldn't have had a choice without funding. And I think this explains why there was no dramatic ending or exciting story about the end of the show, as it was likely never planned, and rather it would have just been quietly pulled from air at a time where the internet was still too new to archive everything, leading to a rather inconspicuous and definitely uncharacteristically quiet end to the darkest children's show ever made. Or at least that's what I thought. Following season 4 is a series of twists and turns that I could have never seen coming, as somehow the story gets even stranger from here. And it all starts with the bombing of Gaza in 2014. During this time, there was yet another bout of fighting between the two sides, leading to the destruction of Al-Aqsa TV's headquarters and a massive amount of casualties throughout Palestine, including the death of a man named Mohammed Alari. Mohammed was a 31-year-old actor before he was killed in what was described by his family as a random missile strike that had accidentally destroyed his home, and his story became a huge talking point among Palestinian rights groups, as the man was supposedly a kind, gentle soul who had been working on a local kids program as a character named Karkur the Mischievous Chicken, who his family referred to as the most famous television character in all of Gaza, and emphasizing how much the kids in the region had missed him. The story was so heartbreaking that it was then picked up by outside news outlets in the US, and soon enough, Mohammed Alari's story was spreading all across the world as the perfect picture of the unjust attack against Palestine, as this man was as innocent as you could get. However, there was one major problem. This wasn't the full story. Karkur was in fact a character on TV, but what was often left out of these reports was what show he was actually part of, a little-known program called Tomorrow's Pioneers. The viral story essentially led to the discovery that Tomorrow's Pioneers had somehow returned to air, with Karkur as its new host, and he was far from Gaza's most popular character, as his run on the show seemingly only lasted a few episodes, as I could only find one short clip and one photograph that even showed the character.
لازم احنا نقدم ارواحنا فداء للوطن حتى نرضى ربنا ونحرر فلسطين والقدس. انا بستفيد من صفاتها انه احنا لازم نسير على نهج.
Though it's a brief clip, this tells you all you need to know about the message Karkur was spreading. And either way, Muhammad did not play this role for long at all. In fact, at the time of his death, he had been playing a totally different character for nearly a year now, a character called Nahul the Bee. Though his costume was different, Tomorrow's Pioneers had not only come back, but they had brought back Nahul as well, in which Muhammad would play up until his death in 2014. And though Muhammad was described as a kind, innocent man, his role as Nahul was, well, anything but.
يهود اسمع يا صديقي اعمل ايدك هيك لما يجي عندكم اضربهم بوكس خلي وجهه بنداره
عشان نحرر فلسطين.
انا بقول له يمسك حجر ولما يجي اليهود عنده يمسكوه وبوم.
طبعا الجيران اليهوديين عندي طب الشرطي
بحبس الحرامي واللي بيعمل مشاكل
وبنطخ اليهود صح؟ بدك تصيري زيه؟ إن شاء الله لما تكبري لما نطخ اليهود كلهم؟ كلهم؟ طيب.
The messages taught throughout the show during his run were in many cases even worse than the stuff we have already covered, and if it was more properly archived, I could have easily made a whole other section about this content. But this was the man that they were essentially portraying as this innocent TV host, basically like a Palestinian Mr. Rogers. And I can't believe I'm even saying this, but it somehow got even worse. Upon discovering his true role with Al-Aqsa TV and Tomorrow's Pioneers, it would also be discovered that this innocent man was actually a well-known terrorist in the Hamas organization, and the reason he was quote-unquote randomly caught in a missile strike was because that very strike was made specifically for him, as he was considered a high-profile terrorist. So not only was this whole campaign basically being centered around a literal terrorist, but also, they literally had a wanted terrorist working as the host on a kids show, somehow making all of Tomorrow's Pioneers even more dubious. And as wild as this part of the story is, the most noteworthy detail to come of all of it was the fact that Tomorrow's Pioneers was still very much alive. Of the seasons that I could find, it appears that Karkur had hosted the show sometime in 2013, and was then followed by Nahul the Bee, and then what appears to be some kind of dog character, which their social media team seemingly called Farfour. I was even able to find what seems to be a season that is currently airing as we speak, with the new co-host being whatever this is, meaning that the show is still very much alive to this day. And the show is essentially identical to the prior seasons, with the exception of its host, as Sarah would not reprise her role and instead go on to take up a new career. Interestingly, Sarah was initially cast to the show when Uncle Hazim had discovered her singing at a talent show, and since her time on Tomorrow's Pioneers, she has since pursued that career further, along with even starting her own YouTube channel, where she uploads her songs and a variety of other content, including a call-in section that she had in a recent episode of the show. And it goes without saying, but please do not send hate her way, as she was literally just a kid during her time on the show, and this was basically what she was born into. And though the show during this run was the same style of shocking content, by this point, the outside world had seemingly become numb to it. They had already crossed the line so many times that at this point it wasn't even newsworthy anymore. And plus, with the rival Fatah programming still going on in the region, Tomorrow's Pioneers would seemingly be forgotten. With the majority of the show from the end of Season 4, and really just in general, being completely lost. Though even if most of the show is missing forever, its effects will never be erased, as this content opened the door for Al-Aqsa TV and the rival Fatah-run stations to unleash a slew of kid-centered content depicting some of the most atrocious propaganda imaginable, forever changing the landscape for the children living in the region. And as for the station that started it all, Al-Aqsa TV, well, in 2015 they were again ordered by the Palestinian government to go off the air, an order which they again refused. In 2018, while the station was live on air, bombs began dropping around them as a warning that their building would soon be destroyed.
وهذا يعني يعطينا الفرق ما بين
تطورات في الميدان. يبدو أن هناك عدوان صهيوني جديد على قطاع غزة. لا أدري يعني أنتظر أن الإشارة من غرفة التحرير ومن الكنترول إذا كان يعني هناك أي تطورات أن يبلغونا.
And destroyed it was, as the station was decimated for a third time, this time leading Al-Aqsa TV to the brink of bankruptcy and coming just a few days away from shutting down for good. Yet somehow they found a way to stay on the air. Which leads us to 2019 and their most recent controversy, as the station was accused of using coded messages throughout their shows in order to send and receive messages to Hamas members in a way that was essentially untraceable, leading to their headquarters again being bombed in 2021 and relocated to a new building that will likely suffer the same fate some other day. Looking back on our journey through this disturbing show, I'm still left with questions as to the unexplained gaps in its run, and perhaps this video can help unearth some of the program's missing moments, or perhaps they'll stay lost for good. But if this is where the story of Tomorrow's Pioneers truly ends, then let it be remembered for what it was. A shocking, vile, somehow funny, yet utterly terrifying creation. The darkest show ever made for the most vulnerable group in our world. The children, the future, the pioneers of tomorrow. Before you go, I think it's important to stress that the ideology preached within this series is definitely not how all Palestinians think. In fact, I'd say most in the region condone the show, as well as the media's assault on their children.
هذه شغلات مش للأطفال. الأطفال المفروض يتعلموا ويعيشوا حياتهم.
أنا مني وعلي بمنع أطفالي يتفرجوا على كبير، وخاصة الشاشات الموجودة عنا. فأنا بلاحظ حتى لما الوضع يهدى شوي فبتلاحظ إنه عنا مذيعين وعنا محطات فضائية مشهورة تبدأ بعملية تحريض، حتى لو كانت هاي التحريض غير مباشر فهو تحريض.
And that's why this video isn't some sort of political statement. I just genuinely found this show to be so interesting in the most disturbing way possible. And if anything, this is just one piece to a very complicated puzzle. And if you want more information on this conflict, I definitely recommend doing your own research and not formulating your opinion on this video alone. I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Alexander Duran, America's Grumpy Uncle, Bazoo42, Biznacker, Bray, Karen S., Charles Roble, Daniel Binge, Donovan Aaron, Emmanuel Cadena, Game Gamer, Jake Parsons, JB Funk, J Money, John Stuart Mueller, Catherine Ross, Lacey, Larry Mattingly, Mark PH, Max, Mycrafty Ways, Nathan Backus, Phoenix Morgan, Sam Lutfi, Seralis, Scar77, Skelly, Sub to Micro O, Unblended Korchnoi, William Berg, Trucky Doggo, and Zinsu Sensei.